Good evening. Thank you very much for attending our event tonight, Tahrir a reflection on decades of political movements. My name is Mariana Kerkukli, and I work at Adopt Revolution, an organization that supports civil society organizations in Syria since 2011, and I will be moderating the event for tonight. We will have as well with us tonight Givara Namar, a Syrian Kurdish activist, a photographer, and a documentary filmmaker who's based in Berlin and who started her career in Damascus 2005. We will also have Ahmad Isanuddin, who's a blogger and a media artist from Khartoum, who is active also with Giftna and Sudan Uprising in Germany. Zina Segavat will be with us as well, who is a social justice writer, researcher, and organizer from Iran, and who has been living in self-exile in recent years. In the beginning, I would like to start with a short input from Yassin Al-Haj Saleh article, Freedom, Home, Prison, Exile, and the World, which has been published in 2017 as an entry for our event for tonight. Yassin Al-Haj Saleh mentioned that the exile cannot move away from a new turbulent self that needs care. More likely, she strictly maintains the old constitution of the self, considering this an act of resistance. But this is counterproductive. Separation is the only thing that liberates. Holding on to an old self out of a national loyalty is the true freedom. We need in exile, as in prison, to change ourselves, to become free. This is precisely why exile can be a highly liberating experience. It offers us the beginning of a new learning, a chance to reform old imbalances, an engagement in a global society of strangers, and a participation in building alternative and open traditions. This is possible, especially if we are young and if we acknowledge and reconcile ourselves with the experience of exile. We cannot exile unless we affirm it and accept it. I will start with a flash round with Givara, Sina, and Ahmad, and I will start with Givara. Givara, how is the political movement that you belong to shaped after almost a decade of 2011? And we know that tools such as art was used a lot by Syrian activists as methods of self-expression. How do you see the role that art plays currently in the same context in exile?
I think, next to how complicated it was always to talk politically about the Syrian revolution, starts from the beginning, because the political movement was really weak. It was divided, starting from 2011. How all the parts that were expected to be involved in the movement, they had a step back, and then we were from the beginning divided between the inside and outside. Like what kind of active parties you have inside the country, who can lead the street, who can lead the uprising, who can be political part of this uprising, and then who's actively from outside. This kind of participation from the political side was already complicated in the movement, because we always considered that the Syrian revolution, it was very popular. It started on the street, it started from the people that are calling for their dignity. It doesn't start with a political decision or a political movement who decided to lead the people on the street or actually encourage people to go to the street. No, it's completely started from the street, and then we were waiting for the political sides or political parties to play a role in the street. And this is what doesn't happen, because it was divided, I think, from the beginning into how to look at it from outside, and then from which other power, internationally, globally, it's connected to. And I think this is killed the political, any political movement from the very beginning, because it was not purely strong from the street, it was not strongly connected to the reality of the uprising, it was not connected logistically to the different cities or minorities in Syria. There was a mess about how the political parties or how the political movement, or let's say famous political in opposition sides who were exiled already ages before we started. Like as long as I remember, I grew up in a Syria that all political opposition are part of exile already. They are always connected. Like if you are a political person against this regime, then your place is in the prison or in exile. So the movement was already, the movement that could be part of the street was already exiled. And I think this makes a huge miss for us as another generation to take our political rule on that. And I think all this together brought us to, after 10 years, that unfortunately we could not produce a young political movement that was connected from 2011 to 2020 or 21. What happened was like waves of activism and political activism strongly. And I think now the exile, or in the last 2 years, the exile is playing a role to affect a political movement that can encourage the younger generation, even younger than my generation, to try to go into the scene of the modern politics. So I think this is my perspective on how it's worked. Like, what is the political scene in Syria after 2011, or like now looking back in 2011 and connected to now? I think, yeah, that's it. But the question was also about
The usage of art as a method
of expression. Yeah, I think I'm not like, there was a lot of things and activists happened in Syria 2011. I remember when we were part of it in 2011, 2012, because this kind of art movement was very much connected to the peaceful movement that we call it, that was in cities like Damascus, Homs, and Daraa. And I think Damascus more for different reason, like because the problem is that the whole movement in Syria, the whole uprising revolution in Syria, was very much divided according to regions. And this is what this is what we were talking about now before we start, that the way army divided the country makes all the movement follow this kind of division, because what happened in Homs cannot be moved to Damascus. What happened in Damascus cannot be moved to Aleppo. What happened in Hama cannot be moved to Tartus, to Sweda, to Daraa, because the country is completely divided by the power of the army. And then you will see some kind of method that was really divided according to the places, like where it started, where it doesn't start. Many kind of activities. So the peaceful activists also start in some places, but in other places there was no chance to start it, because the killing was already in the street. Like, people were already getting killed in the street or getting arrested. So it was not easy, and that's why I think some movement happened in Damascus more than other cities, because the way the army was on the street inside the city itself, it definitely, you cannot compare like the way it was in Daraa or in Homs, because in Daraa and Homs they were on the street in the moment on killing people directly, but this doesn't happen in the capital, because it's the capital, it's the capital of the army, capital for the power, capital for the state, it's everything. So they would not put the bombing inside this green square in the city itself. So many things happened. That I consider, me as an artist, I consider it as a pure art act. But I think for people, it was more playing on the street, having the streets back, being able to exist in a street and own the street and own it and play with it, including of changing the color of it, including like making all the squares in a red color, for example, or just throwing thousands of little balls like inside the street, so it's the whole street, it's colored, I think, or like putting a color inside the eggs and throw it on everything that whenever you have like the image or picture of Hamza Assad or Bashar al-Assad, for me, I was enjoying participating in this or watching this, because for me, it's a pure kind of an installation, it's a performance that people are doing. It's an art performance, but I think it was more for people like owning the street, going back to the street and doing whatever it's not okay to do.
Thank you very much, Kifara. This is a quite interesting aspect to the question owning the public space. Now I would move on to Sina, and I would like to ask you, how are the political movements that you belong to shaped after almost a decade now?
Yeah, we discussed this question before. So even though I'm originally from Iran, but in the last couple of years, we realized that it doesn't make sense to remain active within your own country, and clearly the issue of counter-revolution is a regional struggle. We are all in different countries struggling against. So even though I'm trying to be part of, the Iranian struggle, which I don't want to call it Iranian, the struggle of Iran within Iran, I'm part of it, but also I try to be involved with other community groups here in Berlin, especially because this idea of proximity, we're suddenly close to each other, but it doesn't necessarily mean because we're close to each other we're working on dialogue. That work on dialogue is actually, it has to be intentional, it has to be deliberate. It takes effort and it takes creativity, and it's complex because we're coming from a region that it's very socially dense, historically very dense, and a lot of trauma. So in order to put these aside or address them and kind of build dialogue or remove these boundaries, it takes a lot of energy. So, but Berlin allows this a little bit, this as an exile sort of. But I want to say something about the Iran diaspora or exile, is that Iran had it had two waves of mass migration, which both related to the 79 revolution. First one was the first group that left Iran was supportive of the monarchy when the so-called Islamic revolution was happening, which was not Islamic at all. Later became somehow Islamic. And the second one was the supporters of the revolution, revolutionaries, the left, the Kurdish population, the minorities, became victims of the revolution, counter-revolution, became victim of the counter-revolution. So this was the second wave. So this creates the base of Iran's diaspora or exile, so-called. It's these two groups. So theoretically, they are, each of them has its own conception of diaspora and exile because of its different relation to the homeland or whatever region. However, in recent years, especially since Iran's intervention in Syria, I noticed that something glues these diasporas together, and that's partially elitism and nationalism. These two put those so-called divisions of the different diaspora groups together and brings them kind of together, which then it starts to fragment also the relationship to the homeland, like the so-called homeland. People don't stand with movements back home. People start to support war. People start to support militarism in the name of stability or borders, whatever. So this has become a real issue right now, which is being challenged from within by movements inside Iran. These ideas of nationalism, elitism, like everywhere else, like Sudan, like Iraq, like Syria, we see that these demands are almost, hegemonic because no to militarism, no to elitism, no to sectarianism, no to racism. These kind of demands we see that is repeating everywhere. So it's movements inside these countries that are challenging also the diaspora in a way. That's why our role, we have to if we're not creative and rethinking or self-criticizing ourselves, what is my role? What am I supporting? What am I romanticizing? What am I standing for? If we don't question that, we fall into the trap of the elite regimes, counter-revolution, which a lot of people have fallen, sadly. Some of them are waking up, some of them don't. They continue their path and clashing.
Thank you very much, Tina, for this insightful thesis as well. Ahmad, I would like to end this flash round with you. I'd like to ask you the same question as well. How is this political movement in Sudan that you belong to basically shaped after almost a decade now?
Yeah, I think thank you. Thank you all for your input. Thank you, Rihanna. I think probably I was kind of preparing an answer for that question, but actually seen as in divine reflection make me think through when they were speaking about how the social movement. I would just say that, like what I was preparing, say that putting the framework of the decade, we definitely could do that about Sudan. It's not like just a Arab revolution started in 2018, December, 2 years ago. The attempt to topple the regime of Bashir happened during the Arab Spring, like 2011. But before also there was kind of a social and political and civil movement. But during the Arab Spring, there was among the youth that actually what they call them the apolitical who being politicized after the revolution. Youth who tried to say that we can actually try this, what people are trying in the surrounding before actually turn to armed conflict in Syria and before also Libya. And this is like kind of collective hope that's happening in 2011. But who was carrying that collective hope? Was also the beginning of Sudan. So who was carrying I will also return back to what Sina said, that carried by mostly mostly middle class forces who look like we can do like the others, the nation competitions, but also the idea of collective Arab identity, the degree of intellectual knowledge. But the revolution never made it through until it comes from the periphery, until it comes to the idea of bread. And that would happen in 2018. And that would actually bring me 2018 revolution successfully actually united Sudanese because it started from the bread. And I think most of the revolution, when we go through history, it started from this is like, what is my interest? Not looking at revolution is not started with a very, very big political vision. It started from like the ordinary people that going out to the street demanding their rights, but then galvanize these political demands and make it in a political vision. I think what is then we go in this conversation about it wasn't realized in a very good way, which is giving all the time the other counter-revolution forces opportunity to fill in this gap that created actually by the revolution, either nationalist, either military groups, or even actually neoliberal forces, because it is neoliberal forces that they're representative for the international community politics. And in connection to what Jivar actually said, that it is somehow, as artists is kind of creating the vision of imagining, not imaginable. I think revolution also has to be kind of as a vision was imagining, not imaginable. And that was happening. It didn't happen in Sudan social movement. There was a very clear sense that we want better Sudan, but how you make actually this better Sudan through a process of revolution, then everybody will actually bring their proposal. There is an exist proposal, like Gulf area proposal, Saudi Arabia, and Emirates, the nationalist proposal, like the military getting out of the power, or the new liberal proposal of like the NGO civil rights movement and also liberations and privatizations of the welfare state and actually public ownership of society. And I think the economical answer we didn't answer. I don't know who we are yet. But when I'm talking about belonging and existing in Berlin, I would think that I'm belonging now to one of the things that what for me, the question could be, what kind of social movement you are belonging to after a decade? The social movement I belong to after a decade, not what I mentioned in my name, which is Griffin and Sudan Uprising. I think what actually Sina said is like this one is negating nationalist border and trying to find a vision for a revolution, not just in the region, because the region has a south and has a north, and there was a revolution continuing for decades, not just in Syria or in Tunis or in Egypt. It's actually, when we see it like second wave and first wave, we actually make mistaken. It continues from the first wave, and it continues in Zimbabwe, in Burkina Faso, 2013, 2012. It's, after Syrian revolution, you have the south, the middle Africa revolting. And then you have Zimbabwe, which is a very nice model to study, especially for the Syrian, because also the government was putting this idea of like the resistance. We are Mugabe's government, we are the anti-colonial power, how you force us. And it was brutal in the same time, but it reached some places. And most of these cases, the counter-revolution actually took or fought back in a violent way, or took back the power after the revolution. Like in Zimbabwe, for example, the party of Mugabe is the one that governed the country after the election. They faked the election after. So it continued 2012, 2013. There was an attempt also in 2013. And then we come to now what we call it the second wave in our framework now, maybe because our identity is near to each other, our geographical spaces and our regional forces and our language and what we are actually trying to, but we need to negate that, or we use that actually as a space to go more in a connection to it. So I'm belonging to that kind of movement that when I'm speaking about the second wave, I'm not talking about just Algeria and Sudan. I'm talking also about Haiti, and I'm talking about Chile, and I'm talking about all of this anti-neoliberal force and trying to understand this movement as I want to understand the Syrian movement and trying to use the space I'm in to create connection for that. So I'm belonging to this kind of social movement, is still working within what identity give me, like Sudanese, and also speaking Arabic, regionally understand you, Mariana, understand you, Bara, and I have also intersected with, but also I have intersected international forces that actually try to dismantle, this is what you call it, neoliberal institution that, or also nationalist institution. Yeah, so this is my answer for the first question.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and that's quite interesting to see how exile actually reshaped our belongings to those movements and played a role in this. I will be also contributing with a rather short, not very short text by a fifth panelist who was supposed to be with us today, an Egyptian sociologist who did not manage to be with us for security reasons, and which is happening until today with lots of activists from the region, actually. So I'm going to be reading this, and then we will move to the second round. He wrote, "As much as I would love to have participated in this event, the current circumstances do not allow one to freely speak one's mind. I kindly thank Mariana for taking this up for me. The more time that passes, the more it confirms the importance of the space of Berlin for exiles from the MENA region. One of the criticisms of the essay I received was this one. If there isn't a body by now already, isn't that just how it's meant to be? A school of thought? Great idea. But how do you force having a school of thought created if it hasn't come about organically? It's a reasonable question, but speaks of varying worldviews. It is the difference between maintaining networks and creating new audience. It is my hope that the intellectual and creative talent in Berlin makes peace with this dimension of bringing this into being. To speak of bringing a school of thought, philosophy, ideational movement, etc., into being is not just about a question of difficulty, but understanding the motives of why this would be needed in the first place. For me, it was born in part out of frustrations with academia, German academia no less, that does not make space for free-flowing ideas, that wishes for some sort of certainty and to bring things into being. What frightens me is when it's complicated, academic line of reasoning I hear at conferences becomes paralyzed by analysis, that things are so complicated that we do not take action. We live in an era that romanticizes the manifestos and texts of bygone political eras, yet shun if one comes out of today because things are complicated. As if statements of certainty are considered falling back into Plato's Republic trajectory that leads to totalitarianism 2,400 years later, and anything considered a guide should be left to the self-help industry. I know many aspiring intellectual producers in Berlin, but are limited by this unspoken environment. Is this not the original foundation of the humanities and liberal arts? To question on a rational basis, but see beyond the realities imposed by others, which is the foundation of human progress? The storm brewing in Berlin has the ability to produce intellectual works of art that hold political promise. The foggy environment does not allow clear lines to be drawn, nor demands that we search for ways to find points and lines in a world so noisy, blurred, and indifferent. Of course, one is to research, reflect, ask, and try to find patterns, not only of what is happening, but what could happen or could be done, which I know at some or many points will fall shortly of accuracy. The American intellectual Corey Robin argued that, unlike the ordinary journalist or enterprising scholar, she's writing for a reader she hopes to bring into being. She never speaks to the reader as he is, she speaks to the reader as he might be. Her common reader is an uncommon reader. This is what Berlin can allow. a political community or public that does not yet exist, brought into being through collaborative efforts of knowledge production. Publics are created every day. Edward Said's Orientalism book created a new international public. Books do that, speeches do that, events do that, relationships do that. Poiesis is the ancient Greek word for bringing things into being. It was often the subtext from the writings of Cicero to Machiavelli, to many writers of the 20th century. The irony today is that despite their work being studied and praised, their formats that bring things into being, approaches, would not be accepted in any reputable university. The prince, for sure, would be rejected. The problem comes about is because of Pois's implicit association with utopianism, which the 20th century felt exhausted by. The term utopia has understandably been met with negative treatment. Hannah Arendt argues that utopias come with a sterility that eliminates scope for initiative and spearheads the destruction of plurality. As she notes, utopianism, when realized, broke down quickly under the weight of reality. Hence, why the term has become fraught in light of its modern conflation with totalitarianism. Russell Jacobi, however, argues that totalitarianism and utopianism are not necessarily related, at least without distending the concept of utopianism into obscurity. It would be difficult to find a utopianism within Nazism. Yet the liberal consciousness successfully established a rough equivalence of utopianism and totalitarianism, setting both against liberal different types of utopianism, liberal pluralism. Damning totalitarianism and damning utopianism. There are different types of utopianism that endorse plurality away from the utopianism of the ideologists. It is really okay to think in utopian terms while grounding ourselves in Berlin's realities. Those harsh realities will involve visa expires, trauma, displacement, etc., up against the bigger question of how to enlarge the collective narrative and build an ideological bridge back to the Arab world. It will involve endless discussions pointing to a meaningful purpose. Perhaps you will have a problem with the word Arab, then critique it in a spirit of plurality and respect. We want to widen the net, bring more voices in. However, whatever it is, give it a name. Naming is a whole endeavor on its own. Give it a language. Semantic shifts will be pivotal in shaping the future. Overall, we need to break this morbid status quo somehow, not by flinging our arms everywhere, by sketching out and coloring the gray clouds of gloom around us. Not so we can feel happy, but that we can give our surroundings contour, lines, instructions, intersections, shape, and descriptions. Only then can we understand it, confront it, and maybe build something and show a viable alternative. I'd like to kindly thank our friend and colleague who could not manage to be here with us tonight, and maybe we can also quickly reflect within the second round on some of the points that he mentioned on the role of Berlin as an exile city. I'd like to start with you, Givara, and ask you, how can we look at Berlin as a possibility for political movements to continue beyond borders? And that's also building up on what Sinan mentioned earlier.
Oh, I think I can't look at Berlin only like from this political perspective because of being an artist, I think. And because this city was like the way I look at it, I mean, it's difficult to divide these two kind of your personality when you're an activist, an artist, and involved in politics, involved on the other scenes. So the city become part of your identity in many different meanings, like professionally and politically, and like it's inspiring you or taking you or forcing you in many different directions as a human being. So it's not only what you are interested in an activism side, but it's also what you are doing in your daily life. And I remember like when I came to Berlin, when I entered this city, it was like 7 years ago. It was like the place where I felt like, okay, it's a place that are welcoming you for 10 years. I'm gonna open my suitcase for like 10 years, and now already 7 are gone. So I don't know what will be next. But I think this city for me, personally, before me as a like a Syrian activist, it's the welcoming place for all artists from around the world, and it's a unique feeling. It's not something that you take for granted, because it's not about being European city. It's not about being a North city. It's not about being anything except that it's Berlin. It's welcoming. It's international. It's the place that me myself, I don't feel like I have to put all my identity, for example, like elements on the table to be able to negotiate on. You know, this is like from the professional side where I feel like I don't have to put my integration points on the table, because this city it's has this international face on that. This is not like a utopian city as like the way our friend was talking about. I know exactly what kind of like black side it has, but definitely I will give it the chance to look at it 7 years ago when I arrived here, because 7 years ago it was not kind of planned to be the place, the exile of our movements also, you know. It was like the north was all our directions. So for example, when people left Syria, they had no idea that what could be the next. The next was anything safe, including the neighbors country like Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt. For me was the first place I went to. You know, at some point you felt like, okay, the safety, it's your direction. You know, you go and directly to the place that is bring you the safety where you can continue just living. It's just about your life matter, and then you think about what you do next. But I think Berlin becomes in that direction after a few years, you know, after it's become. And I think what gave it this, it's because itself it's an open city. It wasn't like this kind of black German bureaucratic city, and then we all came and we changed it. It has definitely something from its identity as a city that's welcoming all this international movement and kind of activism waves. So it allowed us to be part of this scene, you know. I I am not sure how I can look at the movement as a popular movement, the way, for example, it was described, because I think it's important, for example, to talk about what was in Yasin talk. For example, if I'm gonna to divide it and read it from my perspective, like talking about exile in which meaning, it's first to accept it, and this took us a long time. It took few years, I think, for Syrian and that I know from for people who left with me, for people who were in my domain, in my field, we were in contact even in activism inside Syria or in art outside Syria. And the people who get accepted, they could do something faster, definitely. The people who had to struggle with the denial, it was more frustrating, because like what to accept after prison, what to accept after being like after fleeing, what to accept after having to accept the loss, that you are not the winner in this battle, because the Syrian revolution make us all feel at some point that we lost. We lost. It was a big failure, you know, like all this blood went for nothing, and this is very frustrating. It's very frustrating for any movement, for any group of a human being who are, you know, like not on elite side, but you know, coming from any background, that like how to restart again, from where to restart again. And this is something I always say, for example, Mayana, like we never had a catalog. There was not there was no a catalog that tell us this is how the revolution worked, and this is how after post-revolution works. We didn't have it, not in our experience, not in the Iranian experience, not in the Arab experience in any country around us. So everybody asked us what you have done as a Syrian, so you lost or it cost you all this blood. It's like, I have no idea, except that there is a criminal there still sitting in Damascus, that there is a dictatorship that was killing everybody on the street. But me, myself, as a Syrian individually, nobody gave me the catalog. And then I felt into applying this into my reality in the country. into my work, for example, as an artist, and into my exile altogether. And even now, Berlin, I have no idea what it will be in 1 year from now. There is a huge movement now. There is what Sina talk about, like how we are all together sitting like this. I did not imagine this is gonna happen, because we are all together one scene in exile. We present one political scene all together. It cannot be anymore that what I am presenting as a Syrian or as a Kurdish or as a filmmaker or as a woman or as, I don't know, it's all together. It's all together and it's part of this. So I think we are in a place that we are trying to do something. I cannot describe that there is something exists already in Berlin and that I am part of it, but I think we are together like these people here and other, that we are into work to doing something because we have this capacity of meeting, talking, accepting the exile.
Thank you very much, Kibara. Sina, I would also like to ask you the same question. Also, reflecting on your question on how can we also coordinate activism between different movements, and if we really see it today in Berlin, and how are you experiencing it?
Yeah, it's a tough one, which also refers to the text that you wrote, that you just read. It says at the beginning, it says why it hasn't been formed already. If it doesn't exist, then why it's just an idea, or why it doesn't exist already? I think it goes back again to the idea of I think exile or diaspora, it requires two things. It's an advantage position because we're outside, we have certain safety and security compared to people back home or whatever. But it's also a kind of a challenge. We have to invent, we have to be creative, we have to be finding our own tools to create, to organize. And self-criticism and also criticizing the environment that we're in, it will allow us to kind of, so this is reflecting constant self-criticism so that we're not repeating, we're not bringing our baggage, toxic baggage from home here, whether it's nationalism, classism, colorism, racism, sexism. So we need to remove these kind of toxic things that we're told back home, that this is who you are, like we need to get rid of that through self-criticism. But also we need to criticize Germany here. We're in Berlin. Berlin has a history of radical struggle, labor struggle. It has workers' revolutions in this city has taken place. But there's one issue that in Germany, I'm sure we all agree on, that you mentioned a little bit, integration. I'm going to call it assimilation. The question of assimilation is something that minorities or non-conforming people have always struggled here in Berlin, and it's still very present. And you feel this on an organizational level also, political organizing. The left here in Germany, or the so-called progressives, have not reached out to us. They've seen us as refugees, and they want us to remain as refugees. You know what I mean? They say refugees welcome, but they don't welcome us into their own political spaces. They kicked us out in May 1st when we had the Syrian Revolution flag. You know what I mean? So they want us, they say refugees welcome, but stay as a refugee. Don't bring your agency. Don't bring who you are really with you to our. So we're dealing with a divided political space. One is refugees, immigrants, whatever, blah, 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 and we are Zonenale, Heimatplatz, this is us. And the other one is the more organized, they're connected to parties, they're connected to resources, they have access to representation. We need to challenge this. We really need to challenge this. Like, we should be there, like nothing should be taken decision about Middle East without our presence there. We need to break this division that doesn't allow us to reach this. Berlin is also the center of political decision making in Germany, where it's setting the guidelines of refugee policies and border policing. And so we need to access these institutions, or not just access, break it down. They shouldn't exist, these isolated spaces of decision making that doesn't allow us to engage in. So that's this is what we need to challenge. Self-critique and also criticizing the environment that we've arrived to transform ourselves and the space that we are here now, you know, like, so that we can really continue the spirit of revolution that people started in 2011, you know, like total transformation of relations. It should not exist as the status quo. The status quo is violence. That's why, if I have time, do I have time? So this is, the trick is how to, the trick becomes about how to create certain very clear demands and slogans that brings us together, right? No deportation. Very clear, but we're all struggling against, you know, anti-deportation. You're bombing our countries, you're supporting dictatorships and, you know, climate change and everything in our back region, you cannot deport us back. Open borders. We need open borders. You're investing in wars and destruction, you need to keep the doors open so that IPs people can come in. Of course, they're not going to do that, but this is our struggle. We have to push for it, right? But, so this is another thing I want to say. Sure, right of return is really important for us. You know, everybody that's here has the right to return, and which comes also from the Palestinian struggle. You know, this is globalized demand, you know. Exile is a global condition now. So, and since Palestinians have struggled with this forever, the right to return, I think, is becoming more and more a global situation. We all have the right to return to safe countries, not just to countries with dictatorships and wars still ongoing. We have the right to return to stable countries. However, we also have the right to remain, if you want to. You know, we should shatter these binaries that they either kick us out or keep us. No, we have the right to return, and also we have the right to remain and strive. Not just remain. This is our space. You know, like when I say criticism, the environment that we're in, that means anything that doesn't allow us to strive needs to be removed. Whether it's any kind of limits, institutional, prisons, housing, rent, displacement, gentrification, then we need to like connect to movements here, not just, for example, in Paris or in France, Syrian activists are involved in what's going on. This is beautiful, I think, you know, like this shows that they're coming out against police brutality, against Macron in their liberal politics. This shows this is already a continuation of the revolution, absolutely. I think. And it's beautiful, and we need to learn from these activists like that are continuing, as Ahmed said, not remaining in the identity that we are arrived, but like strive and go beyond that, you know, like through movements.
Thank you very much, Sina. Not being the passive members perceived, exactly, but the active actors and being accepted as exactly. Such. Thank you very much. And I would like also to ask you, Ahmed, the same question. With in addition to, do you see progressive demands within the movements shaping themselves today after the difficulty behind articulating such demands in the context of war?
No. Progress in the context of war.
So the progressive demands that we see currently in different movements shaping themselves in exile, after not being able to shape those progressive demands in a context of war where people needed to survive. But this is an assumption. So.
I think so creating progressive demand, which is I don't know if it's just we're all in a position in the exile to make a demand in a way, or progressive demand. But I think we are in the position, or we are in the space to create or to understand. We're having the opportunity to understand. We don't have the political capital that we actually could tell, for example, people back home, this is your demand, so you gotta make it. But I think we can actually create visions through questions and conversation, which is an amazing opportunity that I'm sitting here, could actually talk to Guevara and talk to you, Mariana, about the experience of not what I read from articles, but this engaging in what you call it in Lucina, an interactive conversation that based on questions Q and A that would actually but what's happened here in Daraa, for example, and then I compare to what happened in Adbaran to see how the passage of the revolution took tracks through a very, very personal experience that engaging with activists. And this is the first thing that I actually want to see. But there's also, I wanted to return back to the two articles, the two interviews, the one from Yassin and the one from, because they actually did putting like Yassin and the one from the ex-Anon writer, which is, it's an amazing also to see in this time, after actually 40 years from the falling of the last colony, still somebody's actually could speak by X, you know, and this is could take us to a time back where actually exile worked in transformation. And I think exile have helped in transforming an older repressive regime like colonialism and slavery. And it actually, by using the spaces that you are in to engage in active conversation to what you call it, to upgrade the conscious, to up-level the conscious in a way. And Berlin was and it actually, Berlin was a space for that. Lesbon, all of the colonial cities, actually the major cities, was a space where knowledge generated for anti-colonialism. And it was used also, it's not integration in that time, but using, what do you call it, the local bourgeoisie from the colonies, whatever. This is another topic. So we need, now we have a different time. So I'm going to the other, the part of the utopian, because I think revolution process is a utopian process. And it has this kind of connection with art and stuff, which again, I tend to vision to imagine, not imaginable, not creating. So, and this is to have this vision to imagine, not unimaginable, that we have this opportunity where people coming from different experiences to engage in a very active conversation. And the other one is we could bring home to our conversation, like what Yassin Hassara said, but there's an important thing also we need to bring home, but also exploit our identity, but also negate our identity. That in the way that we need to engage in the exiled community conversation more than actually the Syrian within the exiled community conversation. Like I need to be able to understand Ibarra more without being like looking at her as entitled of defining Syria. I want Ibarra to look, for example, of what happened in Khartoum in 2018 and giving me insight based on her experiences without telling her you're not entitled to do that. And in that moment, we can able to have an interactive conversation. In that moment, is actually, we use our identity experience, but in the same time, we actually negating it in favor to have a progressive conversation that actually could create our vision. And that would actually could Berlin create. The important also part, which I see that the body of intellectual work, which is that Berlin is actually could make outside the academia. And one of the things that is important that we need to know that geographical spaces is not anymore a space that if you go, in the past people you are abroad to get an intellectual knowledge and stuff like this. This is with the internet and technology, access to knowledge is open to everybody. So everybody everywhere can have an access to knowledge if they are eager to. It doesn't have to have a library in Berlin to have access to knowledge anymore. You can get your information. And this is within this position that the leader who go in the colonial power and then get into the library like a Malcapra Cabral or like not Sankara or like Jomo Kenyatta or all of this like anti-colonial forces who are the leader who understand the knowledge and came with a vision to the new country. This has disappeared. This is like there is no anymore this kind of hierarchy. There is an activism by creating new public, and that was actually the X I've mentioned, is like trying to find this geographical space and creating new political public, because the role of political activists is not being passive, like what you all mentioned, is basically kind of infiltrating new spaces, creating new public, you know, within this is like inside community, and also finding body of intellectual work that's how we can create a strategy, like political strategy. And not by saying that we are having knowledge of leadership that we are bringing back home to the operations, because this is already, the time is over that, but we could actually engage in active conversation that many people actually could participate in different kind of level of languages. And also, why we don't form a political power, that what you said, seen a political power that putting pressure, whatever the strategy is, but I remember, for example, this is a famous Bengali movement in UK in 1964 after the colony, which is pressured that even though it's a former colony, but they pressured the British government and they created political power and actually resulted to many people now being part of British power. This has a problematic aspect, but I meant it helped people of color to get inside the political, and they were all migrants and they're all coming from the former colony. And what we actually could look at it here now, why we don't form a strategy to put pressure, like when we go to speak to the Parliament or United Nations or stuff like that, why we don't tell them that actually we have a power. We don't just listen to you passively. I just take my hand to talk about my people back home dying. No, actually, I could affect your election next time. And I think this is an important thing, the power that we have, whether from marginalized and exiled people, that if we join together, we can actually bring our demand, but also we could actually bring our political tools and a strategy that actually how we make Berlin pro-Syrian revolution, all of Berlin, sources and political movement, how we can create that through making this different kind of lobbies and movement, not just thinking in the leftist atmosphere. We are leftist, maybe for I'm leftist, but we're thinking more broad, like for more getting more political power, but in pressuring all of the institutions through our public. And I think there is many lines could be written. I'm not and see that beyond the academia, like the second, but also this article is a beginning, and Yassine work, and also Yassine work was amazed by it. Without me being in Berlin, I would not read Yassine, no? And Yassine work, it's amazing work. And this is another thing that I could see Yassine work beyond Syrian borders. And without us being in Berlin, Yassine himself being in Berlin, he positioned himself as this like kind of an, what do you call it, an universal intellectual. Instead of being the voice of the Egyptian Syrian revolution, it's like a universal intellectual who can talk about. So we need to negate home, to negate exile. That's Yassine, what he said. We need to negate home in favor to negate exile. You know, نفي الوطن من نفي المنفى. That's what actually Yassine wrote. And this is actually what we need to do in our conversation here and in our strategically or progressing or like building our progressive demand in the future. I think I speak too much.
You are amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So what I take from what you said, building political power, self-reflection and self-critique, that is for me a key of what you said actually for us as activists as well as living in Berlin, and also not to glorify the political environment that we're living in, because we might as well not be detained because of what we say, but we face lots of pressure from police institutions for sure. And finally, with Givara, with the celebrations that were done in Syria through art, and how they can continue in exile actually, and how can art grow. I'm going to start taking some questions from some of the audience. The first question that I have is a rather long one. It's from Hirak, Berlin, Albania.
Wow.
And basically it's of twofold. The first one is how can you classify the Algerian revolution, which is now in the halfway to fail or to succeed? What has the Algerian to be aware not to do the same mistakes like in Sudan or other countries where the revolutions fails, and for Algerians to protect their revolution? So let's start with this question. There's another question by Rebecca, which mentions what was the name of the article by Yassine Haj Saleh you mentioned? This I can answer weekly too, I guess. So the name of the article is Freedom, Home, Prison, Exile, and the World. It was written in 2015, and we can gladly send you the link, Rebecca.
And it's part of the letters, Maria?
It's part of the letters to Samira. Yes, you can also find it on Yassine's website. So back to the first question. How can you classify the Algerian revolution, which is now in halfway, to fail or to succeed?
Yeah, I don't know, can I answer that? Because I think when we answer it, it's very interesting that we deal with revolution by expertise, you know? Like, I know, if I'm coming, it's very interesting that like most of us get this eager to the question of like, hey, when the revolutionary process reached certain kind of point of like how we gonna ask the Syrian and the Egyptian what they did at that moment. And I think it will never work like that, and never had a manual. So, but I think we need to step over this, over the actually Algerian, because I think I would take from the question of like after failing revolution in Sudan, and you said already failing in Syria, and that's good to admit that. That most of the revolutions in the region, all the revolution, they failed because they couldn't face the counter-revolution that attacked the international region because they couldn't create solidarity beyond the nation border. And that's what we are trying to make here in Berlin. And that was actually could be an important. Let's engage in active conversation beyond these exist borders and talking about the counter forces revolutionary like Iranian regime, Gulf regime, European nation, whatever, because they all talk about stability and whatever they want there is mainly they have a vision about the revolution. We have vision, but we need to make that vision. And I think we need to engage in active conversation. And I cannot promise like what will happen to fail the revolution counter forces in Algeria. What I see, they're strong. The legacy of a regime that fought colonialism, I meant in their old statement since the Algerian war against the anti-colonial war, it existed. Like it's happened also with Mugabe in Zimbabwe. And we need to understand that in Mugabe in Zimbabwe, also the old party regime is that take the legacy of the anti-colonial transformation, saying that I'm the party who fought colonialism, and also Syrian regime in a way saying that we are the party who's protecting us from the Zionists in the region, Mumana countries, and all of this kind of the greater good fight that people taking to repress and to kill other people. And mainly we could actually look at that, but you cannot look at that without staging them in one place. And staging them in one place, we need to talk to them. I need to talk to you more, Marianne, about the Syrian regime and how the discourse worked during the revolution. And then in that time, we could say like this uprising, part of revolution that we are trying to undermake, and we are trying to create a vision for it. And we are trying to participate with the vision for it. And that in that time, the uprising is never filled, and that blood, it never spilled for no reason. We could be more kind of optimistic. And that was in the preparation, the ex-writer of the text say that we need to bring hope. And I have a lot of hope. I'm very optimistic about bringing hope is by sitting together and having conversation, writing that down, staging all of this regime, how they work. If they understand each other, we also need how to understand them. And then we can actually launch our counterattack, the next counterattack, the next uprising. Where, how, this we could actually do it from different places. You know, we have the technology, we have each other, we have the language, we have the intellectual body of work we can create.
I mean, I know that we're speaking beyond borders, but I'm always impressed how strategic Sudanese activists take, to be honest. I really, yeah. Zina and Kifara, how would you like to comment on this question?
I don't know. I mean, for me, it's a very small, tricky question to ask for some people. You know, someone from Sudan, some from Syria, someone from Iran. Like, it's like, what do you think about Algeria? It's tricky and smart, like in the same time, because I believe it will be again. It's not smart to answer. Like in which direction you're gonna answer, because I have been once in Algeria in my life, and I visited a masjid, like a city, you know, and what I've seen in this city, it was like this communist kind of a bar where people are talking in politics and an uprising already like 4 years ago, but from the perspective of like, I mean, I'm trying to bring an experience from the locals when I was there, how people were thinking about the left movement and what happened in the international left movement, and if the Algerians are left alone or not. You know, it's bringing the question we asked in 2011, like, who left us alone, you know, like, and what we were expecting from the international movement and from the leftists. Come on, like, I mean, they were dead already, I think. We were talking with buddies, like, speaking about internationals. You know, movement that will come to save us, you know, and this kind of hope or ambitions, it was there, you know, on the air somewhere. But I mean, I can't talk about like what is that struggle, because in Algeria we are talking, and the thing is that in this area you are talking about different regimes and country and society and economic system. I mean, to understand what was Algeria for Syrian in 90s, all the or in 80s actually, many Syrians left to Algeria as a worker, especially like the teachers. And I remember a complete generation came back in 90s, came back from Algeria to Syria because the civil war, because what happened in Syria in 90s. So the context, about one context you're talking about, and how do you understand, and how you were related as a Syrian to the Algerian context, in which meaning? Because talking about Arabism, come on, it's like I am a Kurdish who was like in Tamazigh city, like Arabism, it's not part of the whole discussion in some points, you know. It's different when you are talking with in Egypt context, for example. It's not like when you're talking about Libya. So I think it's very tricky to kind of trying to answer, but the most important, most valid is like, again, to share experience. I mean, the way I can talk about Algeria is through like great documentary films I have seen in the past few years, and that were a pure revolution again. That the films that are explaining the economical context or the social context and the background of the revolution, and where all pain that are coming from, you know, this kind of social justice that never happened, that stay always like an under pain, you know, that will gonna explode in the face of this regime at any moment. I know where this can come from, but I can't tell now what I cannot expect politically anything that's coming for this uprising, for this revolution, you know. I mean, I can follow up, I can try to analyze in a very small angle, because yeah, I cannot say that I am into the context or to understanding that. It's very tricky to be in that place.
Thank you, Vivara. Zina, would you like to comment on this?
This time?
You don't have
Always
to.
time. We make time.
Yeah, we can do that. We
Well,
have still
I'm not
couple of
gonna
questions.
say anything. I'm gonna also repeat what you guys said. We're not expertise. We're not, you know, like we're developing knowledge as we're going, right? So reflecting on the history of Iran's revolution, because my generation has also been disconnected from the history of the revolution. We've been erased, our memory has been totally erased. So we had to find the pieces of memory of revolution, put it together from unbelievable places. So what I've learned is that how do we prevent the counter-revolution from happening? You know, like this is a question that we really need to put our minds and ideas and experiences together to map this answer, you know, like, and I've basically realized two elements counter-revolution relies on, you know. One is the divisions that already between society exists already, you know, all sorts, sectarian, religious, ethnic, you know, like, mashallah, our region is full of diversity and differences. You point one finger there and there's millions of things going on in one spot. So this is an asset for the regime, but it's also an asset for us. If we work on these differences in advance, before, you know, I know that the Kurdish and Arab solidarity that happened in the Syrian revolution, for me, was one of the most inspiring elements of the revolution, which was anti-racism, anti-sectarianism, you know, like that we put our hate aside and we unite, you know. This is the same strategy that Black Panthers used in the US, you know. A few days ago was the anniversary death of Fred Hampton. He developed this unity of different communities together. So we need to work on this. We need to work on our divisions, you know, like these are difficult conversations. These are the discomforting things that, so all I would say is like challenge your comfort zones, you know, like reach out to the neighbors, reach out to the communities that have been othered, whether it's gender minorities, anything that has been othered to you, work on it before we hit the revolution, this grand moment of revolution. The more we prepare in advance, the less we give the counter-revolution space to exploit our divisions, right? Second thing I think helps is clarify what our vision is, not only what we're against. You know, this is something that, again, the Iran revolution, everybody was just what we're against.
And the regime, counter-revolution, constantly say, hey, actually, I'm what you wanted. You know? No, this is not what we wanted. So we need to really clarify on what kind of society we imagine. We need to clarify this in our demands, you know, like we want a violence-free society, you know, we want to have a society that everybody feels safe, you know, everybody can walk around and be who they are and who want to be, you know, and we need to elaborate these things. But it's difficult because, as you said, there's no catalog. We're inventing as we go and we're constantly putting pieces together, right? And it's the struggle of it and how to respond to the moment as we're going. This is something that we all need to work on, you know, like be on the go, you know, like, you know, we need to be improvising. We need to, this is why academia doesn't help us because it's a slow space. It has its own place, academia. It's becoming more and more irrelevant, sadly, because of neoliberal education. But we also need other ways of knowledge production that is, you know, as you said, there's, you know, there's information coming from everywhere. Instead of like scaring and staying away from it, we need to take it, you know, put the puzzle together and connect it, and so that we create the steps as we're going, kind of. So yeah, work on divisions, like detect the divisions that are keeping solidarity away from us, like preventing solidarity from happening. For example, Algeria, I know the Amazigh community, you know, is one of the most struggling communities in Algeria, and it's one of the most at the forefronts of the struggle. It's beautiful because it's a so-called minority. It's been colonized by the state there and also the indigenous. We need to give more agency and space to these kind of movements that have been already suppressed for years before we suddenly arrive to this moment. In Iran, the same. The Kurdish people, the Ahwazi Arabs, the Baluchi people, the Azeris, it's a community that has been all oppressed, you know, but sometimes suddenly the people in like the more privileged class, which is the class I'm coming from, which is Shia Persian class, feels uncomfortable about the situation and thinks, oh, now it's the time to have a revolution, guys, come on, come on. How can then we need to have a revolution? No, it's not like that. We need to work on it, you know, like we need to see when did they rise up that we didn't stand with them. You know, when it has happened so often, you know, and they kept this history also away from us. Yeah. We don't know what happened, why there was massacres in part of the country that we don't know about. Yeah. So this is our responsibility to make sure that we know our own history well, so that we can admit that we made mistakes. We didn't do what was right back then because we felt privileged, we felt safe, you know, like now we're all hitting that moment that's, oh shit, they were right back then. You know, we should have stood with them back then.
I would also maybe add two things where, since we're commemorating today a decade of political movements, I would say I hope that no crimes would be committed against revolutionaries, but I would say document always, because that's one of the singularity of the movements that happened since 2011 until today. We see huge amount of documentations that can hold criminals accountable. And I would say also, as a woman, when there are women in the demonstrations that you are leading, this is not a feminist Western agenda. This is our own feminism forming itself in those demonstrations. I will also ask another question that is from Dalia Wahdan. Is this a discussion of revolutions or insurgencies or a framework for peaceful negotiations with the militarized powers and suppressions in countries like Egypt, Sudan, etc.? What do we think our discussion is about?
It's a question of whether it's this or
Is
that.
this?
What I say, I don't know.
It's a discussion.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't know, maybe I don't know the kind of, because I don't know if we mentioned negotiation before, but mainly, that I think I need to mention things about when we talk about Sudan, is the negotiation was the negotiation with military forces. So this person, if they meant what I thought, or if they didn't mean it. If they meant what I thought, the negotiation was the beginning of the failing of the beginning of the counter-revolution forces counterattack. and the idea of like sitting with the forces of, but there was in all of these revolutions, and that's the thing about having a conversation together. All of this can really, every counter-revolution forces, military, nationalists, supported military exactly, that they actually form different kind of counterattack. I would say three examples. We have Syria, we have Sudan, and we have Zimbabwe. In Sudan, they negotiated. In Syria, they launched deadly campaigns against people. In Zimbabwe, they made the election and they win it. So they faked it and they win it. So they said, okay, Zimbabwe, Mugabe is out, we're going to get the power. And that which could be also, look at it, for example, Nigeria. I don't really want to say copying it in everywhere, but if we put this puzzle together, we could understand that there is many counter-revolution forces have an interest to keep the power and the tyranny and repressions in the country. And it's not just the military, because the military, one of the forces, there is a neoliberal forces. And also there's understanding to our own forces and our coalitions and allies and the people who are working. There's also the Islamic forces, which counter-revolution forces, and they work to the power, and they get their power in certain kind of places. They got the military power in Syria, they got the military power in Libya, and they got the country. They actually win election in Cairo, in Egypt, and they actually being defeated back. And they had certain kind of advantage. I don't want to talk about romanticizing Islam, but they have advantage. They have the transnational solidarity that among their ideology, that they actually could speak to each other, so they understand the situation. So Ghannouchi understand what Turabi did, and Turabi understand actually what Mohammed Morsi did, and they cry each other, and they mourn each other, and they actually feed each other with knowledge and intellectual labor. That what makes them actually a very, very, very strong power in the region, and in connection to Iran also, and in connection to Turkey, and in connection to all of this regional power. And we have the minorities history, which is the minorities, this is an international thing that we see in the falling of union and economical and social unions and syndicates. People run to the minority as a last safe space. The identity of my tribe is saving me if my union I'm working in is not saving me. And this is happening since long time in the 90s. I'm not talking about the issues of minorities and repression since colonialism. The Amazigh has to do with Algeria after the colonial power. And it does exist a kind of a repression. But also will not understand the role of minorities in the revolution. There's some minorities in different countries, they stood against the revolution because they think the revolution is kind of a middle class thing. And then we could actually stage not the stage the minority, we could actually start to understand what's the minority, because it's the Amazigh in Libya, for example, are very connected to the Amazigh in Nigeria. And this is actually people here, we have to speak about it. What is the relationship between the Amazigh struggle and Tuareg struggle and the Kurdish struggle, and also the Arabic Sahara struggle? How they look at the Nubian struggle, for example. What is all of this is minority, the Bedouin, the Nubian, and also we talk about the southern Yemen and how to do the social. We need to understand that. We need to understand that the role of the minorities in the revolution and the role of the minorities in counter-revolution in a way. And I'm not romanticizing any kind of groups. I need to understand. And if I want to understand, I want to speak freely. And I want to listen to other people freely with acknowledging my privilege and acknowledging my existence in a social hierarchy. But we will not discuss with the military. But if one of the tactics is to bring the military down, is to speak to them, which in Sudan they did, and it was wrong. It wasn't a tactic. We saw it as a tactic. So we just spoke to the military, but then in the end, it was a failing tactic. The military was more understanding. Yeah? In Egypt, there is no negotiation with the military because they don't want to negotiate. They don't need to negotiate because they grab the power from the uncle. You know, and it is not like there is no other negotiation when you have equal power. Not I'm talking about like if I have an opportunity to negotiate and get more ground for the revolution, I would negotiate. But if this negotiation defeat me back like Sudan, and if I don't have an opportunity to negotiate even like Egypt, so I don't have to talk about it in the end, you know, and just that what I think. But we are here not even having a power to negotiate with everybody. We just have a power to talk.
I mean, in Syria, it's not.
Negotiation is.
What you're saying, talking about negotiating now, what happened after 2011, I think it's also very important to go back to the history of the military systems in this area and look at the context and how different it is, where it started and how it's developed. Because like Iraqi experience teaches a lot about what happened in the area speaking about, and this is very connected to the Iran. This is how was Iran brought it, for example, to the military system in the area. And speaking about Abdel Nasser experience, it's also tell us like a different history about the context, how Iran and Syria and Iraq and Kuwait and the whole Gulf, was connected military-wise into the dictatorship. How it was, how it was developed in the whole area. And this is where I talk about like the Algerian. It's a different context. Colonialism in Syria, when it was ended and when the military phases started, you can you can talk about from 1947 till 1956, and then from 56 till 33, it's another age, and then to 70 and 73 war. It's a complete, it's a very rich context that you cannot talk about analyzing how they are, behaving and how they are controlling without understanding the historical background of each one of them and how they were connected, how they were developed, how they were connected to the colonialism, and how they were connected to the all other regimes, including the religion, including the Muslim Brotherhoods in Syria in 80s. It's different than Egypt in 70s. It's different than what happened in Algeria in 90s, and then how the military system was connected to each minorities, like the Kurds, like the other, I mean, it's too much. The logarithm, the nets, how it is, it's like too much into understanding. Now you cannot just come and talk about the military system after 2011. You're not gonna go anywhere, I think, because the roots of these regimes, like military regimes, was like there. I mean, talking about the military regime in Sudan, you cannot just start after like what Bashir did. The history is beyond that. We share the complete history in 60s and 70s, and this was a turning point to all these countries and how where we are now to understand. I think it's it's like negotiation. Okay, let's go back a few decades, divide it, and make the samples of each area of those countries, and then come to look at the whole puzzle, because it's a puzzle. You cannot just say like it's like I understand Middle East or North Africa without going there, without going to divide the whole puzzle and rebuild it, and then take the vision out of it.
Thank you very much, Kivara. Yes, I will move to the second question with you, Sina. But before that, I will read two comments regarding the essay. Is the essay to be found online? And the essay that was read out was so powerful. I'm so moved. Will this author be in Berlin to give talks or workshops on this topic? Not yet. The essay is not published online yet, but we will ask the author if she or he would like to put the essay online, and we also will ask them if they will be in Berlin soon, and we will let you know. The last question is from Domi Binka. She or he asks, I would like to ask the panelists what potential they see in connecting their experiences with parts of the collective memory in Germany or Europe, such as connecting the memory of the inner German border with the current borders. Do they think it's actually possible and or desirable also to mobilize support within society? I'd like to start with you, Sina.
Well, I'm not familiar with exactly that history that they mentioned, but I think we touched upon this idea of how do we relate to histories of struggles here as new arrivals, people that arrived recently. I think we just have to really constantly research and understand what's going on here. For example, the Roma people here, like their struggle, we need to understand it, in order to situate ourselves in Germany. What does it mean that there's a society, there's a community that is not allowed to basically exist, like the identification wise, they're not. So we need to relate to that because they've learned lessons that we need in order to understand how to situate ourselves here.
I think it depends on how curious we are, you know, like how much we're looking for connections to other movements. You know, if we're not, if we stay within our comfort zones and which sometimes is out of, you know, not out of, you know, fun, but out of necessity that we under resourced, so we have to work with our own communities to move things forward. But we also need to keep an eye out always, you know, so how to connect to the things that are already happening here, but also just challenge German-wide spaces. I mean, Guevara said that the revolution was taking the street, reclaiming what we were not allowed to be in. And I think we need to, this is a lesson that we need to bring out of revolutions. We need to knock and, you know, challenge any space that is not welcoming us, you know. Where usually where the resources are, where the big decisions are taking place. For example, I remember the Sudan sitting in front of that building. It was such a beautiful thing, but it was, for me, it was also like ironic and almost laughable situation that they're taking decisions about the people, Sudanese people, without any representation.
But who are they? Can you say?
Yeah, the Germans and the European powers and also neighboring countries. Who else was this? Saudi Arabia was there.
So yeah, it was a friend of Sudan group, Saudi Arabia, Emirates,
It's MBS decision.
and US, it was Germany and USA and France. There was
But
actually
in which context?
they wanted, after the massacre happening in the sit-in, they actually joined the international political forces. They call themselves Friends of Sudan, and they made that this meeting, which was very interesting meeting, take decisions. And we compare this meeting to the Berlin Conference happened in 1885, that basically to divide colonies. That is still that we are in the world, that the inner political decisions of certain kind of societies and communities that is actually being taken abroad. I don't want it to.
I think this is something good. I mean, going back to the Algerian question, that like this is something to take for granted. Don't believe anything called Algerian friends, because this is our experience from Syria friends, our Sudan friends. The moment they start with this campaign, know that it's going to a bad place. You know, it's going to a black dark place somehow. So don't go there. Don't believe that. I mean.
Yeah. But actually, the inner struggle, the inner struggle in Germany is also, it is very well connected to the inner struggle, automatically on the Kurdish community, for example, exists here for a long time. For example, you know, that was happened in 1992 after the Berlin Wall, after the burning of the Vietnamese houses in East Germany, the asylum houses. There was a kind of collective mobilization from migrants from Turkey, from Kurdish community and stuff like this to go and rescue the Vietnamese community. So the anti-racist struggle, it is a very, but here it still exists, that anti-racist struggle is very, very connected to what actually we are doing. So when we say, like, for example, that when we are fighting against German weapon industry happening in the southern of Turkey, for example, and happening against Kurdish movement, and also against the weapon industry that now Sudanese military is going to be the second in the road, that's for German army, and Saudi Arabia taking the German army and hitting Yemen, and the attack of the minorities, or like the attack of the people of color in Germany, they are actually interconnected, and I think that was in our activism that we need to clarify and mention, because it's also, there is so kind of binary division between migrants themselves and second generation, third generation migrants, that there's migrants who say that we are just German, we deal with the German problem, but the German problem are really connected to the international problem, and the international problem connected to the German economy and German politics, for us we cannot just say like we're gonna fight racism inside Germany, for example, like, which is an important thing, because there's some people, I hear some activists in the German and Sudanese revolution times, Sudan uprising, they never got like, hey, we want to talk about Bashir, we don't care, you know, we're not coming to this Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and we don't want to have a problem with the German, and we are living here fine. But in fact, this is a trap, because this is also part of this like border fragments that is actually not making any kind of revolution able to process. So if we don't connect, if we don't understand that, if regarding these groups that formed in Berlin, like Migrantifa, they didn't include what happened in the Middle East and what happened in the global South in their agenda, they cannot actually able to understand racism in a way that they actually can fight it. And we also, if we don't understand racism in Germany, we don't understand that actually who is actually benefiting from the weapon industry. And that needed really, really open conversation. And we actually divided, and and we see our solidarity work when we do it together. We just show up. This is like what they call it, like newcomers, immigrants. We show up like for arrest people, but we don't have. But we need to open conversations with other, not just like migrants, also political groups. We need to understand our problems is very, very interconnected, and we cannot just like we are inside the inner politics because we think it's very connected to our politics at home and our existence here in this space. So
I think this is very important idea that Sina started and you kind of continue it. And for me, it's like, what is really the politics in exile? What's the act of politics in exile and how it's different than the solidarity? And how we do define these kind of things and what does it mean to go back to the street? Because I think there is something also, as you said, Ahmed, it's not enough to say like it's good to have a freedom of speech to go outside in the street and talk about against al-Assad or Bashir or whatever. But what is this system is presenting to me political wise and how I am considered as an activist to affect this kind of system, because this was one of our main topics that we always talk about, that we are not blind about what German economy is doing to the chemical attack in Syria, for example, what's German economy and politicians is doing towards that Syria is not safe. And we have a whole campaign that's called Syria is not safe and it's not okay to go back to Syria. And every day we have an example for Syrians who have been killed because they tried to go back because they were promised that Syria is safe, and Syria is simply not safe. Syrian activists here in Germany had to start a whole campaign, putting investment and I mean, there is this hashtag and the campaign is there, you can check it, just to tell this politician that, come on, guys, it's not safe, And I think something else, it's very important to talk about this. It's like this kind of traditional solidarity. And the German society or the German politics, it's used to have it. For example, it's okay to go outside and for PKK or for the Kurdish parties and having thousands, tens of thousands of hundreds on the street because they connected to the left party or to the left movement, while we are here talking until 2020 about the human rights and like, come on, guys, open your eyes. We are too much. We are 100 years beyond that, the way you're thinking about solidarities, Many Germans went to join the movement in 70s and 80s. We are not there anymore. This is different, It's not okay to divide Syria into sections to support it. Because this is a horrible politics. This is kind of racist for me. In a different shape, in a completely different shape. No, it's not okay to support. It's not okay to have something about Northwest Syria that's different from Northeast Syria, that's different from the south of Syria, that's different from Sudan, that's different from supporting Algeria, that's different from supporting Palestine cases, It cannot be divided. In human right, it's human right. And for me, it's not okay. In the same context that you mentioned, why there is an association or a solidarity movement that's bring Kurd and Tamazight together. I don't know how, they identified, who identified it, with what, it can be culture-wise, art-wise, I can get it, but political gathering as an act together in the street that's supported by German, I think it's completely kind of blindness about the main issue that we have a dictatorship in this area, guys. And this is what your political economic system is supporting. And it's not the cultural problem of how it belongs. Let's go back to colonialism, talking about culture, Orientalism to talk about culture, war, but we are just not a naive activists who come from the third world and now they have a space to talk about their issue openly. No, I think it's a time to talk about when we go back to street, when you go back to Berlin street, When we go back to movement in Berlin, it's the chance to speak about that we have an open eyes, simply. You know,
We see the truth.
we see the truth. You know, we see when a piece of a caricature. 2016, it was right. This export import when it was about like how you import refugees by export weapons.
Yes.
I think the street is not blind. Activists are not blind. Movements are not blind. And if you allow something very traditional and very old to be okay in your streets, you know, and if you still make the struggle between the extreme left or extreme link or whatever, or it's no. I think we are beyond this kind of movement as youth movement still, if we're still gonna consider this.
Thank you very much, Livara. Just a short remark on what you mentioned regarding the campaign. Syria Not Safe is a campaign that started 2 years ago to say strongly that we are against any deportation or any discussion on deportations to Syria because Syria has no safe areas. Tomorrow there will be a demonstration in front of the Interior Ministry in Berlin at 10 a.m. And we will be demonstrating because on Friday the Interior Ministers will meet in Weimar, where also we will be demonstrating as well at 3 on this Friday. So
meeting where, the second one?
in Weimar. So join us and support the campaign because those deportations did not stop before when people were deported to Afghanistan, and they will not stop after they start deporting people to Syria, if so, or if it started happening. I would like to take your point, Sina, and then I will go to the last question that we have.
I just wanted to continue what Gara was saying about this, the way Europeans or white people, I'm going to call it, they pick and choose struggles in the rest of the world as how they want, you know, like, so it's very ironic because at the time that people are trying to unite in Middle East, they're trying to put their differences aside and unite against the struggle. We have these people in the West which have this Orientalist vision, or their perception of those places of the world is based on how they feel about it. They pick and choose. It's like as if going to shopping malls, you know, like I like Palestine, I don't like Syrians. I like Syrians, I don't like Kurds. I like Iranians, I don't like Turks. But it's really because we are trying to create a politics that includes everyone, all of us, you know, like we can't leave anybody aside. Because if anybody is not safe, that means nobody's safe. So we're dying to get this politics out. And then we have these people here. The problem that we need to challenge is because they have more access to representation. That's why their worldview is dominating, you know. The way they see the Middle East is dominating because it's been like this for hundreds of years, you know. This is the colonial, and I think it relates back to the text of you wrote in the event text Swana, right? And these are the discussions that people are having. Mena, Swana, Wana, what should we call it? I think it's not a matter of necessarily the name, but it's like calling the issue, you know, like that we're dealing with a Western-centric view of the place that we're coming from. We cannot even relate to the place that we're born and lived because it's defined by the gaze of the Europeans. And this is what Eva Saidas talked about in this Orientalism. And we need to change this. We really need to challenge this and speak up and like not be begging for. And Yasser Ahmed also has talked about this in his critique. Yes, in his critique of solidarity, which is very important. And solidarity is not charity. We're not here begging for your attention to be, oh, pick me, no, pick me. But they want us to do this. You know, we need to shatter it and say, no, it's our rights and we define our struggles. You're here to, you can be an ally if you want to, but it's not your space to define the terms of our struggle.
Thank you very much.
That's my question. Okay.
I will go to the last question and I will ask you free to answer it and maybe give also a final statement from your side. So do you agree that the support of the revolution by the diaspora would be best to put pressure on the governments of these Western countries like Germany to stop supporting regimes like in Egypt or in Algeria? And if yes, what is the best way to achieve this goal? So maybe I would start with you, Ahmad, and with a final statement as well.
Yes, I don't know. I think can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Do you agree that the support of the revolution by the diasporas would be best to put pressure on the governments of these Western countries like Germany to stop supporting regimes like in Egypt or in Algeria? And if yes, what is the best way to achieve this goal? This is from Sa'youb.
Yeah, I like always. There's no. If we have a manual for how the fronts could work, we could actually this conversation could be more easier. But we want that conversation of how we create a political power that putting pressure on regimes to stop supporting a repressive regime. But also we need to understand, all of this politics design in this neoliberal space. I don't want to end the argument by saying like capitalism is shit, because it's not a neoliberal conversation, but neoliberal capitalism in a way that the politics of interest is important before ethics and ideology. So I think inside the German political framework, whatever you do in the street, there's still important for them the interest of Germany, the nation state, the neoliberal politics, in US, everywhere. So we could actually thrive within this ethical conversation. And now what I think is important for me by now, we need to think about like how we could actually do work in favor of revolutionary forces by putting pressure on this regime, by creating political power for ourselves. We don't have political power, we need to admit that. And we have spaces that we need to create a strategy that creates political power in the spaces that we are in. So to take the advantage of the exile, create our own political power and put pressures on the regime, with understanding also that fighting this political power, this is my last statement also, that we need to understand that the terminologies that's actually that define us. What you talk about, like the minorities, which is what you said, like Edward Said quoted Anwar Abdel Malik is saying like the hegemony of possessing minorities. And so academia defined us based on like Middle East, Southeast Asia, whatever, and this definition comes, if we actually don't sit together, we cannot change these names. And we cannot find even how I call you, that we need to sit together and then we find a new categorization, a new classification that makes us able to have a language, alternative to the language that exists, and that need a lot of labor work. And this labor work that need a lot of kind of conversation that need to take spaces. Like we just talk about MENA. What is that? The form of solidarity. What's also, what is solidarity is, that we need actually to talk about our own solidarity and defining it. Just criticizing solidarity is not enough. What is the solidarity that we need? And this is somehow we need to go beyond what is defined about us, and that we need this space to have the conversation so we can fight this hegemony of possessing minorities. And this is not just in academia, it's defining us in a bigger scale, like MENA, Global South, Sub-Saharan, and all of this kind of definition, which is all has to do with the classification of the American Library of International Politics, which is very important to understand, but also the other definition of leftist group that defining us, like which kind of solidarity has importance, which is very important about the last topic, that Kurdish solidarity, Sudanese solidarity, and it's also part of this is the hegemony of possessing minorities. Which kind of minorities that you actually interested, like video games? I'm interested in Battlefield. I'm interested in South Mexico. I'm interested in Egypt. I'm interested in Palestine. No, I'm not. We need to go out of that because we don't have that privilege to be interested on, in one of them. We need to be interested in all of them and understand all of them, recreate our own politics and put pressure on the local politics for international solidarity as we want to define.
Thank you very much, Ahmad, for these last words. Ivana?
I think it's the same, like if it's called a final statement or an answer to this question, because I still believe that we don't have the catalog. Nobody still give it to us to know what's the next, to have the detailed strategies as Ahmed said. But I believe that it's not about to be optimistic or frustrated, first of all, because it's beyond that. For me, it's about time, because I think one of our biggest questions now, assuming when we talk about that we are start talking about a decade, you know, it's 10 years already now. What happened and how we deal with that? How do we approach time? How we think, analyze, and what does time brought us next to all the intellectual income, the outcome that come from these 10 years, you know, how did we try to analyze all this movement, you know, how we did analyze the history after, like before and after these 10 years, because everything got changed, the perspective got changed, you know, and I think we come up with a few like things that are not able to negotiate, you know, to compromise on it, like human rights, for example, and or feminism. It's not anymore things to have it as a privilege to speak about. No, they are the core. They are what to go towards on it. It's the creative expression on human rights or feminism, for example. It's not a privilege anymore. It's what you need to be acknowledged on the street. Creative expression or the new expression, the modern expression, it's not anymore privilege because you need, it's too much what's going on in a human life, human being's life, you know, and things you have taken consideration are beyond your expectations, including corona, for example. You know, what we are witnessing in 2020 should change our speech toward what to do, what's next. The question of what to do should be responsive to everything that happened after 2011 till today. And yeah, I think like open eyes, you know, trying to analyze everything, looking back at the time, it's a major thing. Like it's what we have to do because I don't know the answer of what's the result to go into strategical point, but it's the question of like where to think, you know, where to go to think to know anything about what to do.
Thank you very much, Rifara. Sina?
Yeah, so it looks like the whole planet has reached a stage of not knowing what's next, right? And I think, again, Yasna Saleh has said, let's call it impossible revolution, right? Like, we need to be naive enough and realistic enough at the same time to demand the impossible. You know, that when you become, actually it's a slogan, it's a historical slogan of revolutionaries saying, be realistic, demand the impossible, right? Like we need to stick to the demands that actually seem very crazy, you know, like bring down the regime, you know, Tasfot Bas, you know, like Kollan Yani Kollan in Lebanon, you know, like people in Iran are saying no to that party, no to this party, none of it. You know, like in the US, people are saying abolish prisons, abolish the police. These are crazy ideas, I know, but we need to go with the craziness. We need to go crazy. that this is, then we can claim of what you said. You know, the unimaginable. You need to imagine it. That this is when at that stage, then we can see the future. Because until we're comfortable with what is allowed or what is possible, we're not gonna come out of this. You know, like we need to actually push for that impossible state until that everybody is safe. You know, until everybody is secure, protected. You know, safety is a collective struggle. It's not individualized as the system wants to tell us. The neoliberal policing system that tells us you will be safe as an individual unit, as a family, as a nuclear family, as a nation state, as whatever. We need to really break all this. You know, that impossible. Just demand the impossible.
Thank you very much, Sina, for your last words. My last words would be think solidarity differently. So basically, when we talk about German solidarity with our causes, we don't necessarily say that we're living in a country where democracy prevails. We're living in a democracy, in a place where which exports weapons, which wants to deport Syrians and deported before people from Afghanistan. We're living in a country where police brutality is there as well on different levels. And I think solidarity starts when we start acknowledging the problems that we're having right now in this country, and not only as journalists, but also as people living in this country, because that brings the equal rights to fight this fight. And then challenging them. And this is the first step, I would say, towards achieving solidarity with our movements as well. And I would thank you very much. And I would take also with me from this panel.
Thank you for the great moderation, actually.
I would take with me some words like, we are not passive members, we are active actors. We're reclaiming our spaces and our public spaces because they are ours. And also, friends of Sudan were not really friends. So friends are overrated. I agree. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for all of your questions, and stay safe.
And for our ex-panelists.
Yes, and our amazing panelists and our ex-panelists. Thank you. We're not online anymore. We are still online.
We're still on?